So you suddenly found yourself in the role of a medium, against your will.
They were all around me. Can you do this? What do you think about that?
And you went along with it.
Yes, of course. Honestly, it felt like a rush. I just did all of it. Afterwards, I thought, gosh, what just happened?
And the goal really was a doctorate?
Yes, because I thought I needed it for people to believe me.
How does consciousness arise?
Consciousness. That's a terrific question. If only I'd known to prepare for it.
Frau Rahlfs, Sie sind seit vielen Jahren als Medium tätig.
Miss Rahlfs, you've worked as a medium for many years, and your intuitive abilities have also helped you succeed in corporate boardrooms, without having actually talked much about spirituality at the time. Now you're choosing to speak about it openly. Thank you for being here. You've also written a memoir spanning 20 years of your life as a medium.
Und ich möchte mit Ihnen zunächst über eine Begebenheit sprechen.
I'd like to begin with an experience you describe as a doorway into another dimension. The death of your grandmother. How did you experience that time and what followed?
Ja, für mich war das wie eine Initialzündung.
It was like an ignition. These topics hadn't been on my radar at all. I did a lot of sports, pottery, manual things. I'd studied graphic design and worked in advertising. Very different, surface level. When my grandmother fell ill, she joked that she wouldn't subject herself to the machinery medicine in the hospital. I loved that.
Dann setze ich einfach mein Leben mal auf Stopp.
I pressed pause on my life, became Nurse Petra, and stayed with her for 6 months until she died. We had a wonderful time, but during those months, things happened that didn't fit in my reality, culminating in her dying in my arms, which is what I had hoped for. Those moments made me think in ways I never had.
What kind of moments?
One was very striking. My grandmother was already very weak, bedridden on morphine, unable to stand. One night, I heard a loud noise. I lived with her, so I went to check, thinking she'd fallen out of bed. I wanted to walk to her, but she was already coming my way. She was walking down the hallway toward the bathroom, moving like a carefree 15-year-old teenager. She was completely relaxed in her body. She wore one of those open-back white gowns you get in a hospital.
Even though by then she hadn't been able to stand up on her own for a long time.
She couldn't. She was already so sick that she couldn't stand up. I thought she must be sleepwalking and has forgotten she's sick. I walked beside her to catch her in case she collapsed. Though honestly, I wasn't sure I could hold her. She still weighed over 40 kilos. So I followed her into the bathroom where she told me that Grandpa was coming to get her. He'd been dead 10 years by then. She also told me some things about my partner at the time, things she couldn't possibly have known. I wrote them down in my book. I don't know if you've read it. Things she couldn't have known.
She advised you against him.
The things Paul is doing, girl, I wouldn't put up with that. That stayed with me. I brought her back to the bedroom and didn't talk to her because I thought she wasn't really awake. I just listened, then tucked her back in. The next morning, she couldn't stand again. But what she'd said stuck with me.
How long before she passed was that?
A few weeks, I don't know exactly, but it was the final phase. She had pancreatic cancer and was on morphine. That might sound dramatic, but we also had a lot of fun. We really had a joyful farewell. That was the first experience that I couldn't quite place. That night raised unanswerable questions. How could she walk? And not anymore the next morning? And the content. I couldn't confirm what she said about my grandpa, but those personal details about my partner, it was all true.
Would you share the story about your partner?
I hope you won't see this. It's been so many years, over 30 years, so, well, she said word for word, "Girl, you don't deserve to be cheated on by Paul." That sentence carved itself into my head. That was just one of the things she said. But later, a lot made sense. Like our neighbors at our house by the sea in Holland had been looking at me strangely. I wondered what was wrong with everyone. They all knew. I was the only one who didn't. My grandmother tipped me off.
That must have been an decisive experience for you, because you suddenly had this information.
Im Raum stand, da gibt's Informationen,
ja, also ich habe das natürlich abgetan, habe gedacht, das ist Morphium. Ne?
At the time, I brushed it off as morphine talk, but it was all true. This was in 1993, so I think I can talk about it. It was all true. Looking back, I'd say her soul was already partially outside her body, and the morphine made her open and chatty. She just talked through the night.
There's a phenomenon known as terminal lucidity, where people, even those with dementia, suddenly became clear and recognized loved ones.
Yes.
When she told you she'd be picked up, was life after death even conceivable for you then?
I couldn't place it. The picture filled in later. I was with her when she died. She passed in my arms, which I'd wished for. I'll never forget what happened right after. These are the moments that stay with you even decades later. My grandmother stopped breathing, and I was holding a lifeless body. I suddenly thought, oh God, I no longer love my grandmother. Hopefully no one is seeing this right now. I felt no connection to that body. I almost felt found out, because everything I had ever loved, it was like a tin can with the fish already gone. And then came this moment that changed my life. I heard a clear voice inside me. If you still spoke the language, you could still communicate with your grandmother. I couldn't shake that. I could feel she wasn't in the body anymore. So I looked around the room and said, "Grandma, are you still there?" The next day, I visited a friend and told her what had happened. She said calmly, "Do you know the Swiss doctor Elisabeth Kübler-Ross? I have a book, take it." She went to her bookcase and grabbed that book. I read it in one night and knew, this rings true.
Until then, the afterlife or dying phases weren't topics for you.
Not at all. I was very science-oriented. The fact that Kübler-Ross was a doctor impressed me. That book set something off in me. It matched what I experienced. I knew it was true, even if I couldn't yet believe it. That was the beginning.
Did you have any after-death contacts with your grandmother?
Later, yes.
But not right after.
Actually, it started right away, though I didn't want to admit it. Well, actually, that hasn't really changed. For about 4 years, my grandmother was with me. I started studying psychology in Freiburg, my second or rather third course of study, because I thought, no one will believe me, I need a doctorate.
Did you then feel a presence? How did these contacts begin?
It started a few nights after her death. I woke up with my arms raised because I'd been reaching up to take her hand in a dream. I startled myself awake like that. I'd say today it was contact with her soul, accompanied by vivid feelings of presence.
Feelings of a presence. Were there messages too?
Yes.
Einmal, da war ich dann schon, während des Studiums in Freiburg kam meine Großmutter.
Once during my Freiburg studies, she came to tell me something to pass on to my mother about events during the war.
Also während des Krieges stattgefunden haben, weil meine Oma aus der Position, wo sie jetzt war, also
an apology and an explanation from her new vantage point from outside of her body after her passing. I knew nothing about it. I agonized. Do I write to my mother? Will she think I've lost it? In the end, I wrote a careful letter. Mom, as you know, since Grandma died, I've been exploring invisible connections. Could it be that your mother came to me again? She said the following. I wrote down everything my grandma had said and sent off the letter. My mother was floored. It all matched things she knew. She had no idea how I could know. It was spooky for her.
After your grandmother's death began a time that you describe as 7 years on the road. At some point you met a clairvoyant. Later you had your first out-of-body experience yourself. Can you talk about that wandering period up to that point?
You have to understand, I was insatiably curious, as if a new life were opening up to me. I was 34 when my grandmother died. What she'd said about my partner proved true. Because of that, we separated. And I put my seaside house in Holland up for sale. Around then, I was invited onto a TV talk show through a friend who had gotten invited but didn't want to go herself. She thought it might be something that would be interesting for me. I still lived in Hanover then and said, "Sure, I'll do that. I'll drive to Cologne and take part in the talk show." I thought it was very interesting. They put makeup on me, and then I sat there with all the cameras. What I didn't know was that the show was called something like Young People Without a Partner. What Does Society Say? And on top, help, I'm 30 and still don't have a man. We were all laughing when we sat there, and I thought to myself, gosh, Petra, what is going to come of this? Well, a pile of letters came of it. A pile of letters that was sent to me after the talk show had been broadcast. I took a look, and there was one letter I didn't understand. It was a DIN A4 page. There was a kind of half arc on top of it, and then it said pendulum chart. I had no idea what any of it was. One box was ticked, and underneath it said, "You are at a high spiritual level of development. I would like to meet you."
So that was in one of the letters you received?
Yes, from one of the men who had written in. By then I was single, because I no longer had my partner.
So you didn't primarily take part in the show because you were looking for a partner?
Of course not, no. I just wanted to be on TV once and see what it's like to be on a talk show. And I wasn't prepared for that sensationalizing title at all. It was said to be a program where you talk about what it's like when you're living without a partner over 30. And I also didn't expect people to be sitting at home writing letters to the TV station. And then they get sent to you tied up with a red ribbon.
With a pendulum chart.
Yes, there were others in there too, of course. But one thing that made me curious, since I was already curious after the experience with my grandmother, was the pendulum chart. I called the gentleman, and it was so interesting because he had had a near-death experience. And after the near-death experience, he was in contact with his spirit guide, as he described it. Something I couldn't place at all back then. But I drove over there and visited him in the Black Forest to hear the story live. It wasn't so much about the man, but more about my curiosity to learn more about that world. So that's what I did. I went and had a look on site. And then I stayed overnight in the guest room. And I'm telling this now because it was another kind of ignition for me. That evening, I had a conversation with the man that I couldn't quite believe. We sat across from each other at the table, and I had the feeling, this is another world. He told me about his near-death experience, how it all was, and that he had read many books since then. I sat on the other side of the table and listened. It felt very far away. Somehow, I thought it could be, or it also could not be. And then I stayed the night in his guest room, and woke up and looked at the clock. And I saw it was one of those old clocks, where the numbers, you know, the ones from back in the day, they flip over, and it said 302 or 303. And I think to myself, where are you? Where is this clock? I tried to remember where I was actually spending the night, because it was unfamiliar to me. And then I think, oh right, you're at Robert's. But then I noticed that this alarm, or should I say this clock, was in his living room. But I was sleeping in the guest room. And in that moment, I really thought I had been sleepwalking and had looked at that clock. I was in another room, and I got a fright. I startled because I thought I had walked there in my sleep. And in that fright, I felt my body pulled together a bit, the way it does when you're startled. And then, as if I had a cord attached to my back, I'll keep it brief, it pulled me by that cord through the wall back toward the guest room. There was one wall, then another room, then another wall, and then zap. I landed, that's how I describe it today, in my body, and opened my eyes, and it also felt as if I had sand in my eyes, as if I had been looking in another direction before. They were a bit gritty. I lay in bed and thought, this can't be. How did you get back here? And then I jumped up, out of bed, ran into the living room, and checked what time it was. and the clock still showed the same digits. So it must have been fractions, less than a minute later, fractions of a second. Apparently, I was pulled back by this cord, which I didn't know then, like an umbilical cord. What's it called again?
The silver cord.
Silver cord, yes. I didn't know that term at the time. And here's the thing. I could remember the walls.
The resistance?
No. The layers of wallpaper. I still knew everything. My consciousness had been pulled through there, and I could remember each layer. Fibrous wallpaper, wood chip, painted, brick, cavity, then brick again. I could remember it all.
Meaning things one couldn't actually have seen.
No.
Those were the wallpapers, glued on top of each other over many years.
Yes, over the years, the paint and underneath one that had a pattern, and then eventually the brick, and then the cavity and brick again. I rushed into the kitchen. I knew there were some scraps of paper and pens there, and I wrote it all down. And then the light went on, because the man of the house I was visiting woke up, and he asked what I was doing. I said, I'm writing down everything I experienced. And he said to me, I still remember, don't get upset. You had an out-of-body experience. I'll explain it to you tomorrow. I have books on it.
Did he know about that as someone who had had a near-death experience?
Yes, he himself had also perceived himself outside of his body, but he had built a whole library in the years after. It was like going into a little spiritual bookshop. He read everything he could get his hands on. And the next day, he gave me books to read as well.
So that was, so to speak, the first out-of-body experience.
It was an incredible experience.
How then did the topic of mediumship come into play later on, during those years of wandering?
It came to me. The experience was in 1994, I think. And around 1996, I was in Heidelberg and invited to a party there. My friend Alexandra said, I'm bringing a friend. That was me. And she's clairvoyant.
Why could she say that?
Because I'd done it with her. I could already do it, but with her I had the trust. I'd never done it professionally, not with strangers.
But what does that mean? What could you tell her, for example, in the personal realm?
I had discovered that I was able to, I would say, in the dimension from which we arise, I saw, at the beginning, one has to say, something like images, as if water were flowing into oil. I could make something out, and that created a sensation in me. Then I practiced. If I saw this now, does it prove true? First I saw something, today I'd say with the third eye, then I got a bodily sense to go with it, and then I began to translate. She was one of the people I practiced with, and of course, she thought it was phenomenal. At the beginning, I couldn't yet verify it.
But what kind of image was it, for example? What did you see?
What it was in her specific case, I don't remember anymore. But they are statements about people, or about professions, or about real things.
That fit to their situation.
That fit their situation completely. Actually very striking, clear things.
And they could also give direction.
Exactly. Let's say a particular illness, why she had it and what advantage it also had, or the downside. I first had to learn that what I was perceiving was, I would say, like an image made of zeros and ones. First I had to learn, what does that mean? How can I translate it with my body so that it makes sense to the other person? I practiced, I think for 4 years before I started professionally.
So images come. And the work, the thing to learn, is what they say concretely with respect to the other person.
I'll go how by I do it today. That was my initial phase. It's like when children learn to walk. I was completely new, like Obelix who accidentally fell into the soup.
The magic potion.
I had no preparation. The magic potion was suddenly in me, around me. And then I had to process it first. And my mind, well, I'm really very scientifically inclined. I wanted to understand everything I was doing and also be able to take responsibility for it if I was going to do it as consulting.
So you had already practiced privately with your friend, with Alexandra, and then she introduced you as a medium.
Yes, which I hadn't known. I arrived, and there were lots of people there. It was a large private party, and she had said, "My friend Petra is coming. She has mediumistic abilities." And then 20 people were around me, and it was a bit like a coming out. Basically, I've tried to write it that way in the book as well. It was like a guided path. Left to myself, I would probably have practiced for another 10 years, so to speak.
So you suddenly found yourself in the role of a medium.
All at once, and they were all around me. Say this, what do you say to that?
And you went along with it.
Yes, of course. Deep into the night, yes.
What were you able to say there, for example? What topics, what kinds of questions?
Oh, it ranged from, has my boyfriend cheated on me, to, do I have the right product for my company? Or should I move now? Or does it still need time? Real things from life. The kind of things people want to know.
And how was that for you?
I can tell you, it was like a rush. I just did all of it, and afterwards I thought, oh gosh. It was so sweeping, the way I experienced myself. And because I simply had no time to think, it was fun for me too. So much so that I then moved to Heidelberg. It had consequences. I kept going to those places. That's why I said at the beginning it was like a path of wandering, because life drew me there. I came into a scene of people who all found it very interesting.
And that was then your start as a medium.
You could put it that way. But there was a key situation that catapulted me out of the city and out of the whole thing again. I was sitting on a chair, like here, and there were a good 20 people sitting on the floor. That was the time when you typically went to a guru. He knew how it worked and you yourself didn't. You asked questions. I experienced that once and thought, no, that's not my path. I'm leaving. That's really how it was. I then decided to go back to university. I had interrupted my studies.
Meaning you wanted, so to speak, to stay grounded.
I didn't want to be a guru.
You didn't want to be a guru. On the other hand, the abilities were there. Did you then have a specific plan, what to do with them, how to use them?
Yes, my friend asked me that too. She said, "Why are you leaving? What do you even want?" I still remember it. There are these moments that are so special. You surely know them, that you don't forget. I was standing in her living room, and it spoke out of me. I'd say it spoke through me. I said, just imagine it, I hadn't even finished my psychology degree. I had only just started practicing with these people, consulting. And I hear myself say, I want to get into the boardrooms of German big industry. I want to do business consulting. And then be on the 8:15 news to talk about it. I remember because it was so impossible and so far away. I have to laugh now, because later on I did go into industry, but I simply didn't want to be in that scene and be a guru people ask questions to. I wanted normality, and so I went back to the psychology department in Freiburg and was willing to continue there and get my doctorate.
So the goal really was a doctorate?
Yes, because I thought I needed it so people would believe me. But I was held back from it. Today, I'd say I have a kind of spiritual guidance that has plans for me, or my soul was guiding me. If it had been up to me and my everyday waking consciousness, I would have just pushed through. But when I was riding my bike to my undergraduate final exam, I heard a voice in my head that said, "You're going to fall off the bike." Again, one of those moments when I feel someone is speaking in me and says, "You're going to fall off the bike." I see myself sitting on this bike and think, no, nobody's falling off here. There was absolutely no reason. I had an old Dutch bike with fat tires. It doesn't tip over anywhere. In that moment, I tapped the front wheel against a little curb. It was really 3 centimeters high. Normally, you just bounce over that. Then my hands and feet were like paralyzed. I couldn't move anything. For fractions of a second, I truly couldn't move my hands or feet at all. That led to me hitting the curb again. And then, like a wet sack, I just keeled over with the whole bike. I really fell to the side, and my head bounced against the curb 3 times. And I just sat there thinking, what's going on? What's happening? Someone came over who had seen it and said, "Are you okay? We've already called an ambulance." And he must have picked up my backpack and put it under my head. And I'm thinking, why an ambulance? I instinctively raised my hand and felt resistance. I had an egg-sized gash, well, that's how big the bruise already was, on the right side of my head. In that moment, I had an experience. I felt a golden column of light, that's what I call it, like a broomstick, slide in behind my back. Behind the spine, not exactly at the spine, but a few centimeters further back. It slid in there the whole length down my spine, and then this gold light expanded like a tube around me. And in that moment, I was lying inside it, inside this tube of light. And I had the awareness, something I didn't know at all during waking consciousness, that I could heal myself. I didn't know anything like that. I'd never read it anywhere. But the moment I was lying in this golden light, it was clear to me what I had to do. I have to place my right hand here on it. Then I have to breathe the bruise out and let it flow out again through the left hand.
Sounds simple.
Totally. And breathe very calmly. And the moment I started doing that, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the ambulance pull up. They came running with a stretcher, laid me on it. I was still breathing, and they slid me into the vehicle. I kept breathing, utterly calm. For me in that moment, everything was completely okay as it was. Then they wanted to put ice on it, which is logical. And I said to the paramedic, "No bandage, no ice." I mean, you think they'd say, "She's hit her head, we're not listening to that." But I can only tell you, they left me as I was. I must have had such an authority that they let me keep breathing like that all the way to the hospital. Even then, I was thinking, why aren't they doing anything? I could see myself there breathing, and at the same time, I found it strange that they were listening to me. And 10 minutes later, when we arrived at the hospital, the bleeding had already stopped. The wound was closed. And then I went home, at my own risk. And that next night, I witnessed a spontaneous healing, my first.
So you discharged yourself and went home without treatment.
Let's put it this way. The doctor said they'd found no fractures at the hospital, and no internal bleeding or anything where they'd say I had to stay immediately. Everything looked okay. But I should have stayed for observation. I said I wanted to go home, and he said, "We can call you a taxi, but then you have to sign that you're going home at your own risk, because normally we'd keep you here." I signed it, and somehow, half in trance, I wasn't really in my right mind, I went home by taxi. I wouldn't have let me go, but they did. They let me go home. Then I called my friend Katja, and that was interesting too, because she actually researched spontaneous healings at the Bruno Gröning Circle of Friends. She looked after me that night. She stayed at my place.
And she then witnessed a spontaneous healing firsthand.
She got to witness it herself, but she was completely overwhelmed at the time. I woke up in the night and had my first out-of-body experience. Consciously so. I was standing behind my bed. Next to me stood a spirit guide, that's what I would call it, and I also saw myself lying in the bed. I was lying in the bed, and he said to me, "The bruise is being cleared away now, and in future, that's why I'm telling this, it was a key experience, you will perceive differently." We had to do this so your brain can carry the high frequencies. You will perceive and translate. This is a healing process that is now taking place, which will produce a particular state.
So the whole accident was, so to speak, planned.
The purpose was for my brain to be a better biocomputer afterwards, I'd say. In the moment, later I questioned it 1,000 times, shaking my head, but it was completely real. I perceived myself in outline. The figure beside me was even more tenuous in energy, and then there I was, physically in the bed. And at the same time, very interesting, I was a small golden sphere that slipped through the neural pathways to cleanse them like golden light, and then carried things away down the spine. The movement was so fast that I sort of blacked out. I lost consciousness. I couldn't keep observing because it was happening so quickly, at probably light speed. I don't know what to call it. In any case, the next morning when I got up, I still thought maybe I'd just had a dream. I went into the bathroom, past the mirror, and thought, I'm not seeing this right. Everything was gone, and where that huge egg had been, there was only, as if I had briefly brushed a wardrobe door, a little yellow, a little mottled, almost nothing. And at the hospital, they had told me it would take weeks for the bruise to be cleared away, that it would take weeks and that I shouldn't be alarmed.
When it migrates downward.
That it would move downward and I'd look terrible, but there was nothing.
And that was important for the mediumistic work that then developed further.
I can tell you it was. As luck would have it, I also ended up with Mr. Haffelder. You may remember the name. He had an institute in Stuttgart. He measured me with his devices and explained that my brain on one side showed a state like a monk after 20 years of meditation. Only I hadn't meditated. It was the first time I learned that it's normal for people to think. I'd already had the opposite. I hardly ever think. Thinking is effortful for me. I've always had a contemplative, meditative, resting state in my brain. Under normal circumstances, you don't really talk about that. I had it all my life. Only through the accident, I assume, it became distilled, so to speak. intensified by the inflammation and the cleansing. And that is what helps my perception.
Let's come back to your intention. You wanted something down to earth. You didn't want to be part of the scene. Your goal was to work in boardrooms. How did that come about? You achieved that goal advising large companies. Can you tell us a bit about how you entered that world and how it developed?
There was another key moment. Through certain circumstances, I ended up as a consultant at the company Questico. I always wanted normality. I didn't want to be Merlin, the wizard, or the witch Abraxas. I thought, I can't do that. I'll write professional medium. And that's what I did. So then all kinds of people called me. But entrepreneurs called as well, because I presented myself differently within that group of mediums who offered their services through a center.
But a company doesn't go looking for a professional medium.
The entrepreneurs called me privately. It wasn't the company seeking me, it was the entrepreneurs. Not only them, everyone called, of course, but entrepreneurs kept showing up. And I thought, I love this. How great to support strategy consulting, team composition. It was easy for me to say who didn't fit in a team. You have to imagine, people have emotional states. It's hard to convince someone to change something in their life if they're emotionally attached to it. That cost me a great deal of energy. In a company, you want things to run. If I say, there's the hurdle, the CEO of the company will remove it faster than you can blink, because you want the company to function. In the private sphere, it's harder to advise a single person in a way that truly changes things than it is to advise a whole company, because there aren't so many emotional entanglements. That's how I discovered my passion for consulting.
So the entrepreneurs came to you privately and then hired you for the company.
That would have been nice, but life seemed to want it differently. At first, it helped me realize what I loved doing. I did a lot of consultations, thousands, and sometimes I was so drained I had no strength left. I'd lie in the bathtub at night with tears running down my face because I expended so much energy for people that I thought I won't last long if I keep doing it at this intensity. The corporate consultations brought me joy and cost me no energy. Then a kind of love for it arose. I'm telling you this because I believe that love for something can move a lot. I thought, how did I get here? How can I do more of these corporate consultations? And then it happened that I got a call from Matthias Zobonsen, based near Frankfurt. An entrepreneur, a professional in the field of large group conferences, even back then. He'd written books in that area. He called me about a question concerning his firm, outside the platform I worked for. He had simply mistyped something while searching on the internet, by chance. My guidance kept letting coincidences come to me. My website, Spirit at Work, has hyphens. He typed it that way, but actually meant a site with the same name in America, without hyphens. 2 hyphens made it so he landed on my homepage and thought, that's interesting. I have a question, I'll call. I call him my midwife. He helped birth that path. He was so delighted that he called again to ask if he could recommend me in his newsletter.
Und was ich nicht wusste, ist, dass dieser Newsletter
What I didn't know was that his newsletter back in 2004 went to 2,000 entrepreneurs and consultants in Europe. One mouse click, and I had changed my field of work.
Taken as a whole, what's your impression? Are people in industry and boardrooms open to spiritual content? How did you experience that?
I always said the German-speaking world is riddled like Swiss cheese. They're everywhere. You wouldn't believe it. That openness to the spiritual, to the invisible, made visible, was everywhere. I worked in small companies in the mid-market and of course in industry, because I especially enjoyed having that leverage. The largest unit I got to support had 3,000 employees. It's wonderful to see you can make a difference. It ranged from selecting division heads or managing directors to strategies abroad, subsidiaries that were to be built. You have business partners, or you have to choose between different partners. I was allowed to help across the board.
Can you describe a bit how that played out inside you? How did you know what was right at a given moment? Who fit a group and why someone didn't? How did you experience that?
While I was doing that, I also had a limited company for bionics, biology and technology, observing algorithms in biology and translating them into technology. That's very complex, but I acquired knowledge about how natural algorithms and natural systems function. Everything we experience has a certain order, not just spring, summer, autumn, and winter, but when does the grain grow? When can I harvest, and how do I move as a human being within this natural cycle? Companies function according to these cycles too. I can only sketch it here, but there are specific systematics I recognized. Now my perception came, on the one hand, from the energy field, the aura, the life field of my client. I can read that. And I can reflect on what I'm perceiving, and for their business partner too. If I had a name or a photo, I could simply step into the other person's field and read it like a scanner at the checkout. Naturally, I got fast over time. After thousands of consultations, on that platform, everything had to be fast. It was like a real sport, a workout in my head, so to speak. And when I came into industry, I had already practiced a lot. I'd become very fast.
So, in other words, you dealt with a system. You knew what developments could happen, which cycles might come. And on the other hand, you looked at the people, saw their goals, and could then say, this fits now.
I could combine the two. But it was always important to me, and I think that's understandable, that my client can fully follow and also sign off on what I say. Not that I just hand over an answer they can take or leave, but that they feel inside themselves, yes, that's right. Because I believe we unconsciously know many things that don't make it into consciousness. That has become my life's theme, consciousness. I help my clients into consciousness.
And that works by giving pointers, by giving reasons, by saying, look at this or that? How does awareness arise?
That's a terrific question. If only I'd known to prepare for it. Awareness arises when I can describe a situation to the other person, set it out so vividly that they experience it. Then they can actually decide, yes, that's good for me, I want to do that, or no, better not, or that's advantageous for the company, or oh, that's true, but I don't want to move it in that way. I put them into a situation in which they themselves decide what they want to do. I provide specific scenarios for that. That has always been important to me. And it creates a different feeling. If you go into a consultation and get answers thrown at you, afterward, it's hard to retrace which path do I take now.
Could you give a very concrete example without names, so one can picture how this works?
Of course. Let me go back to my first CEO, the first time I was invited. It's a good example. He had picked out a successor and said he'd built the company for 40 years and wanted to leave it in good hands. When he left, he wanted things to be rock solid. Someone had to take the company on and carry on in his name. And he said, "This can't be. I chose him myself, but the longer he's here, the more I dislike him. I don't know where that's coming from, if you can help." He'd chosen him. There was a 6 or 12-month trial, and he couldn't pin down what it was. I still remember it because it was one of those special moments. I asked him a few things and was then able to describe to him that the successor, whom he actually wanted, was transgressive in everything he did. When everyone wore a suit to the board meeting, because that is customary, he came with a turtleneck. Always little things like that. A smart turtleneck, but not with a tie like everyone else. And while everyone else went to the CEO across the corridor and spoke to him in person when there was something important, he just wrote an email. There were always little things like that that provoked the house rules a bit. And I was able to make it clear to my client that what he was defending was, I'll call it, his ego. But we can take a look at whether this man is good for the company. I remember my client writing down transgressive and underlining it 3 times. I still remember that today because it was a key experience. He hadn't noticed it. Of course it bothered him, but should it really be relevant for his selection? I then asked him a few questions and was able to explain to him that this man, who would soon be taking over his position, was also leading the company into a different era. Previously, the company had always had a pull effect on its customers. In other words, they had been approached without doing anything. And the time when I was doing this consultation was already more challenging. You had to push the boundaries on the outside in order to get the right customers and the right number of customers that the company needed. Crossing boundaries in a friendly manner and doing good for others, that was necessary. In other words, the future CEO had to have a completely different management style in order to lead the company to success. And he did lead it to success. But my client's waking consciousness, or ego, somehow felt a bit offended, which was definitely the case. But it was a great choice for the company.
So he had actually chosen the right one.
Absolutely. He'd chosen well. Good gut feeling. This was the man who secured the company's future.
And represented it properly as well.
Yes, represented it properly. He was just personally annoyed because the man didn't wear a tie.
So you were successful as a medium in industry. Was that then your final home port? Or were there further developments that steered you in a different direction?
I always say, jokingly, for my little chubby ego, it was the final home port. If you'd asked me, I'd have stayed. I'll do this forever. Friends thought, we don't need to worry about you. You've landed where you want to be. But I believe our path is also guided. And then, a personal blow, let me put it that way, knocked me completely out of it. Thank God it wasn't an illness. I'm very grateful for that. But it was a disaster in my private life that completely undercut the professional side as well.
Because it demanded so much attention.
Totally. It needed so much attention, I was constantly arranging things. And of course, I wanted to jump back onto the train I'd fallen off of. For years, I tried to write to my clients to somehow get reconnected. It was like a curse. It just wouldn't work. Until I finally realized the door is closed because it's meant to be closed. There was another path. And I had to learn that the hard way. I simply couldn't go back. It was closed off to me.
And what was that other path?
I began to get in contact with people's souls. They simply came. It looked as if a slide projector were throwing an image into the middle of the room, not onto a screen, but into the room, and the pixels would build up. Then these beings spoke with me, and when they were finished, or our dialogue was finished, the pixels dissolved again. And that was that.
Could you give a concrete example, an actual case, of how that happened?
Perhaps the first one, because I remember it so vividly. There were many later, but the first was striking. I was standing in the bathroom in front of a mirror, and next to me an image began to build. Of a woman I could perceive an outline, not sharply drawn, as if you could see the pixels, but you knew what it was. And she spoke to me and said that I would bring joy and meaning back into her husband Harry's life, because she had died far too early. And when she had said that, the image dissolved and she was gone. And I should add, I didn't know any Harrys. I couldn't place it. But the experience was a key moment, so clear, as real as you sitting here. And then, suddenly, you're no longer there. So I couldn't just push it aside. It stayed at the back of my mind. And then shortly after, on a platform, I was on a dating platform, a man wrote to me. His name was Lucas. We met. And when we met, he said, "By the way, my name isn't Lucas, that's my son's name. I'm Harry, Harold." That rang a bell. And I remembered, I took a closer, more conscious look and thought, on the man-woman level, she must have been mistaken. It wasn't a match. We didn't fit on that level. But it was such a pleasant meeting that I met him again. And through me, he ended up with a completely different work situation. I was able to connect him with a job, better said, a position that brought him real joy. And when at some point he said, "You've changed my whole life, I have joy again, the team is fantastic, I love working there," I told him the story. He cried, and so did I. I was so moved. And in fact, without doing much, I had changed Harry's life. just as his wife had said.
But he was so open to your story that you had encountered his deceased wife that he could accept it?
Yes, I gathered all my courage. Back then it took me a bit to overcome myself. And he began to cry and said, "I knew my wife was an angel." He was completely open to the idea that there is something between heaven and earth that still connects him with his wife. And if she hadn't appeared to me, if she hadn't told me that, I wouldn't have been so open to what then unfolded. I might have said, "This doesn't fit between us, period," or something like that. But it simply arose out of that pleasant contact, a complete professional change. And it led to what that soul, the wife, had told me being true. She had died very early at 50. And I had more and more experiences like that.
And was that then also a path for you that took you away from consulting in industry toward other fields?
No, not really. In parallel, I kept trying to get back into industry, but it's not on my plan. Honestly, being here with you is a bit of an ignition point. I thought, okay, I guess I have to show my true colors now. Because over those years, when I was living in Rosenheim, it all developed much, much further. But the first experiences were often like practice, again.
Many people turn to mediums in personal crisis when a relative has died. They look for hope, for a straw to clutch at. And I have the impression that in the scene, not everything that glitters is gold. How do you assess the scene? Are there things one should watch out for if considering going to a medium?
I've certainly had an unusual path. I should add, I myself practiced for at least 4 years before I allowed myself to charge for consultations. I held myself to a high standard of cleanliness, that's what I call it. Then, when I was confronted with it, especially in the Black Forest near Freiburg where I lived, I went to at least 30 mediums to see how they did it. I made an Excel spreadsheet to track the overlaps. After all, they all told me things about myself.
You asked them the same questions?
Yes, I went to the mediums. I tried everything I could get my hands on. Then I went home and made a list to see where the intersections were, whether they all said the same things or whether it was different for my own sake. Also to see where I might place myself. And I found, how shall I put it? The wish was father to the thought. Many of them, most of the ones I visited, didn't sit right with me. I'd always wanted things to be traceable. But I also developed, I should add, a good feel for who was projecting and who was truly clean.
Projection is the issue.
Yes, they have their own issues. The point is to translate what you perceive for the client in a way that helps them. As a medium, as a transmitter, you offer yourself like a straw. That straw needs to be as clean as possible, so no extra stuff comes through that isn't relevant for the person sitting there. I've witnessed a lot in that regard.
And can that cleanliness be learned?
I think so. You can learn it. You need to develop a good feel for your own perception, but also for your own life, where you stand. That can be learned.
Learned? Do you think that every person has mediumistic qualities to some degree?
I personally do. I think consciousness is the key word, and that everyone unconsciously is already living their perceptual abilities. And there too, it's a question of, do I do it consciously or do I just react? Do I employ my perception, my empathy, my intuition, my consciousness? And can I reflect on it? Or am I perhaps reacting to my environment without noticing? I might even be a good medium because I always react to my environment exactly the way my environment wants me to. So yes, I think every person is mediumistic in a certain sense. But not everyone engages with it as much as I do, for example. I've devoted my life to it, and of course, then you become a specialist in that field.
So it would need to come out of the unconscious into consciousness.
Yes. For me, consciousness is the real key word. Whether it's a private individual or an entrepreneur, if you have awareness of the situation, the environment, your needs, doors can open. Simply through what is perceived. It's something else, of course, if you say, I also want to hear voices when I'm standing in the bathroom, I want to see pixels too, then you may have to practice a bit more.
But in other words, these are essentially abilities that belong to being human. And in our society, it's simply not common to look there. That's also perhaps a question of one's worldview.
Definitely.
And view of humanity.
We have resources that would let us perceive our surroundings more finely if we had learned to. Getting images from another dimension, as I described, from souls visiting me, or when I connect with another person's aura, that's perhaps not given to everyone, because you're essentially stepping outside time and space to look at a different screen. You can practice that too, but not everyone will manage it in the same way. It also has to do with a basic predisposition, but there are other things I can't do. Often those are people who are very grounded with a very different, distinct energy field. They may not be able to beam into the invisible, but they're wonderful at materializing things.
So the transition is essentially fluid. Intuition, empathy, all those things that are mathematically, quantitatively describable. Every human being has them.
Yes, everyone does.
The question is, to what extent one develops them.
Exactly. You can shape your life much more consciously and perhaps more pleasantly for yourself if you train these basic human capacities.
What is your view of humanity? If a person is not only their body, their ego personality, what essentially makes us who we are? You also distinguish between soul and ego.
Between soul and body, I would say the body belongs to my ego. I perceive the body as a filled hard drive with many experiences from this life stored on it. And I'm also confronted with experiences I had in past lives, which have often been stored in me in a different form again. There's a nice image. One should learn for oneself to be like the ox harnessed to the cart. Picture the soul standing on the cart behind, and it's actually supposed to be guiding the ox to run in the right direction. With us, it's often the other way around. The ox runs in whatever direction he wants, and the soul is no longer steering.
The soul is tugging at the reins.
Yes, it wants to. But he still does what he wants because he thinks he knows better. I think what we call the ego often believes it knows better where the body ought to go.
So it would also be about listening more to the soul, letting it lead.
Yes, and you can do that with the vibe tools, as I called them. Perception, empathy, intuition, and consciousness. If I give those room in my life, I can more easily get what you just described. the felt sense of where my innermost self, my soul, actually wants to go. Am I there, or have I ended up somewhere else, head-led?
How should one imagine the soul when you're perceiving someone who has died? Are those more like images, so that the soul becomes graspable in a certain quality, but they are really just translations? Or is life on the other side actually imaginable the way it is here, only finer, of a different kind?
No, lots of things simply aren't possible. In our dual system, we're subject to certain laws. By that, I mean things like gravity or day and night, the things we experience here. Many present laws we live under here, the soul does not live in those. The soul level, which lies outside time and space, I nevertheless perceive only in a limited way, because it also belongs to the body. It has a certain limitation. It isn't one with everything. The soul has particular tasks that are reflected in our bodies, in our being here. The soul doesn't know time and space in this sense. And yet it can still reflect on where it is and where the body is. And I've trained my brain so that I can do that. My brain is the bodily organ for translating. When a soul comes, I speak with it as I speak with you. Strictly speaking, that shouldn't be possible. But I've trained it so that this kind of communication is possible, and that meaningful content comes through.
So when you communicate and pass on what the soul has said, that's essentially your translation work.
Yes, exactly. If I had to draw it, I paint a soul the way, for example, a person's aura is depicted. And consciousness, what I am, I notice right now I'm sitting here, moving my arms and legs, but there's someone sitting in this body. I perceive that like zeros and ones. It doesn't really have a form. It's simply the pre-stage of something material.
Information.
Yes, that's a good word for it. Information. It doesn't sound romantic, but in a sense, that's what it is. As consciousness, this is how I experience myself. You still exist without this body, but many feelings you can enjoy in this body, feelings that belong to human life, you can no longer feel then. That's why you should enjoy your time here.
But there is an experience, a deep experience, a very different kind of experience.
Yes. In such a state of being, it's far less judgmental, much more free of value judgments.
You also mentioned earlier the interconnectedness of all souls.
Yes, I find that remarkable in any case.
That's an important aspect of it.
And often, people who have some physical contact, their souls are in contact with one another because you accomplish or do something together on earth.
So the soul level lives more from that connectedness. Is that where the capacity for empathy, which everyone has, comes from?
In us, you mean?
Yes, from this connectedness with the soul dimension.
Yes, of course. I can feel empathetically connected with a person, even if they're not in the room, but in another city. Then I'm essentially in contact with my soul field, so to speak, with theirs, via these energetic threads. That's what I call them. That's where what we call empathy comes from. For example, when a mother senses that her child, who happens to be in another city, isn't doing well or is doing very well, those waves of feelings that just arrive, there's an energetic thread along which that information runs, like we know it from the internet.
At the end of your book you write, quote, "Over the course of 20 years, my path back to God took shape. I call it that because I rebuilt my faith, stone by stone. My faith in a higher power, in that ineffable force that drives us all to keep going, to keep living, to never give up, even when life is nothing but a challenge." Is that your central message? That life has a deep meaning for every person?
Oh yes. Most definitely it has a deep meaning. But I'd like to add a line, because it only came after the book. I have no prior schooling in church, the Bible or the like. I read nothing, no confirmation classes and so on, just to set the baseline. And I was given a sentence from the spiritual realm, as it were, which I found phenomenal. Trust in God, and He will follow you with His deeds. Meaning, trust in something higher and you'll receive the echo in what meets you out there. You'll be helped. And I find that a fundamentally relevant statement. If I manage to look at the world positively, then things will happen that support me on my path. First, I had to work to regain that faith. Honestly, when I began, I would have trusted the natural sciences more than anything else. But now, to say, I trust in this higher power, and then things happen, it follows me with deeds, then something follows. That's what I experienced. If you can do that with devotion, that may be something I'm quite good at. Then real wonders happen, things you don't expect, coincidences that come to you. I can only recommend it.
Can one learn trust?
I can say that I dug my trust free again by making peace with my mind. I plunged deep into the natural sciences, physics, mathematics, biology, chemistry, only to find I can actually let all of that go. I didn't need it, but I had to take that path through the head. I don't know whether that's how I learned trust, or whether it was perhaps already there in childhood.
More a matter of digging it free than learning it.
I dug it free.
Thank you very much for the conversation.
Yes, it was very nice.
I thought so too. All the best to you.